Patterson Foundation
strengthens people, organizations, and communities by focusing on issues that address mutual aspirations,
foster wide participation, and encourage learning and sharing.
Welcome to Rising Resilience, a Beyond the Blog podcast generously funded by the Patterson Foundation. We're here to share insights from our community preparedness, recovery, and resiliency initiative, and more. In each episode, we'll explore the disaster space in our area and how people, organizations, and government entities are working together to establish a resilient Suncoast region. My name is Leah Verier-Dunn, a consultant with the Patterson Foundation, and your host today as we get to know the Community Preparedness, Recovery, and Resiliency, or CPR-R Initiative. To deepen our understanding of the CPR-R Initiative and to highlight the important happenings is Karen Windon, consultant with the Patterson Foundation and the CPR-R Initiative Lead. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Leah. I'm excited about today's conversation.
Me too. Karen, you're involved with several of our initiatives at the Patterson Foundation and have a history in community-focused work in our area. Tell us about your background and what brought you to leading this important initiative.
Sure. I've been with the Patterson Foundation for just over 5 years. Such a great place to be engaged with. But prior to that, I spent about 35 plus years in local government, Manatee County, and about 20 plus of those were in the public safety arena. So I was a paramedic, and then I ran their disaster operations. I had the opportunity to respond to multiple disasters across the state and then the southeastern United States. I was a state president of our association. I served on an international commission as the chair of that commission on emergency management, preparedness, and accreditation. So when Deborah approached me about leading a disaster initiative, it just felt almost like coming home. I think that there's so much that happens in our world in that realm of disasters, and the need for us to be prepared and really resilient in that space is so important.
And you must have really seen quite an evolution over time being in that work for so many years to now in the way that disasters have shifted in our area and our response to disasters.
Yeah, I mean, originally it was the old civil defense, which is, a response to war times. And now we really do try to be proactive, but still taking into account the individual impacts, the human impacts of disasters.
On our first podcast, we discussed with Deborah Jacobs the evolution of TPF's disaster funding over the years. Now, what's different about CPR-R, and how did TPF come to prioritize the work that this initiative is doing?
Well, after Hurricane Ian hit our area in September of 22, it became very evident that there was a lot of work that needed to happen there. We need our communities to be more resilient, to be able to bounce back from those disasters. We need focus in that preparedness space and just making sure that people, organizations, and communities are ready to react, to recover, and sort of integrate those responses so that we become a stronger community at the end.
That makes so much sense. And in CPR-R, in its name, identifies preparedness, recovery, and resiliency. What does it really look like when we focus on these three pillars of disaster?
Well, historically, the disaster cycles have been preparedness, response, recovery, mitigation, and all of that leads to greater resiliency, or the ability to come back stronger to a new norm, if you will. You may notice that in our title, response isn't a part of that, because we know our first responders in our communities have really great plans. They know what they're going to do. It's sort of integrated into their everyday operations, just on a larger scale. But it's those other three areas, the preparedness, the recovery, and the resiliency, that needed more of the weaving of fabric to develop a stronger infrastructure or ecosystem to manage those disasters. So for us, that preparedness side is making sure that people have a plan, that they know what's going on, that they have disaster supplies, that agencies and organizations and businesses think about what a disaster can do to their viability. 40% of businesses fail after a disaster, and after a year, 25% more of those fail. So we know that to keep people employed, to have a vibrant community, that preparedness side is super critical. I think the recovery piece is so interesting because as humans, when a disaster disappears from our TV screens or computer screens or our audio, in the mind of most people, the disaster is over, when in reality, that recovery goes on for years, a decade or more, as communities try to recover and reestablish what they are. And again, that resiliency is interwoven in all of it.
Yeah. It's interesting that you brought up the point of once it's kind of off the television, how if you're not in it, it's hard to identify that it's still happening. But I think that's true even when you're decently local. We think about what happened in our hurricane season last year and how much our area was affected. But if your neighborhood wasn't, after those first few weeks, life still continued, and you might not be identifying how many businesses or people or homes are still dealing with their recovery efforts from that experience.
And the really hard impacts on those people who were impacted, that they are continuing to live that every day.
Mm-hmm. With an abundance of focus turned toward strengthening the CERT ecosystem, and maybe you can help our listeners understand what CERT teams are in our Suncoast region, what does that translate to in terms of the work that CPRR is doing?
Yeah, so CERT teams, or Community Emergency Response Teams, CERT, C-E-R-T, are really the epitome of neighbors helping neighbors. They're neighborhood-based teams that are there in the immediate recovery, trying to find out how everyone in the neighborhood is doing, what the needs are, doing a really quick assessment. But they're also so active in that preparedness space. So there's opportunities all year round for CERTs to be a part of a community. Typically, they're neighborhood-based. So your neighborhood might have a CERT team, and we have lots of them across our communities, all of them in different stages and ages, different capacities and capabilities. And I think the beauty of CERT is that anybody can be a part of that. It doesn't take somebody who's got 30 years as a firefighter. It might be somebody who's really IT focused, technology focused, and wants to help that side, or who's creative and wants to help in other areas of a CERT. I think it's also interesting that CERTs are not a new thing. They were originally established. They came out of the LA Fire Department back in the mid-'80s. They had been studying disaster responses in Japan and Mexico and found this concept. And then in the mid-'90s, FEMA adopted that and made a national training standard for CERT teams.
So there are things a community could do to start a CERT team in their neighborhood if there wasn't one that already existed, because there's a bit of a system in place to sort of start from scratch, so to speak.
Absolutely. And I think part of that is just making sure that people know about CERT teams. What we've found is that a lot of people have never heard of that concept, and so they feel a little bit of a loss at how to begin with that.
Yeah.
But the value of it is really powerful. In years gone by, we had very connected neighborhoods. You knew your neighbors' names, and your kids played together, and you had potlucks and all of those things that sound like Leave It to Beaver. But I think that our neighborhoods have gotten away from that in a lot of cases, and so CERT teams can help rebuild that sense of community, in essence, creating a safety net for people. They know who in the neighborhood might be infirm or might, be recovering from a major illness or injury. They know who should be in the neighborhood and who's not, and so it really does create a sense of strength and community across our communities.
Yeah, it builds that connective tissue that we always talk about, and then the way that one community can connect with another when you have an organized system, helps that cross-pollination a bit more.
Yeah, and I think in answer to your question about what CPR-R is doing in that space, it's making sure that those teams all know each other. So within each county of our 4-county region, teams are somewhat well connected, but across those county lines, there's so much opportunity for them to learn from each other and to build on their experiences.
That's so wonderful. I know that the Patterson Foundation is committed to engaging the community at large through widespread participation. That's something we do with all of our initiatives. Why do you think starting with a focus on the CERT teams is the best way to do that? You hinted at it a little bit, but I'm curious if you can dive into that more deeply.
So our friend Rich Harwood, who is an author and a change agent, often talks about smallifying. Like when we want to make a big change in the environment, we start small and we start in building that immediate capacity so that we can continue to ripple outwards. And I think CERTs are a perfect example of that. We have CERT teams in our communities that are 2 or 3 people. And we have CERT teams that are 300 people. And so the ability of that and the scalability of that is really important. I think that's where we feel like we can really bring some excitement around what CERTs provide, as well as building that conversation across communities. As I said, lots of people have never heard of a CERT team. And so to be able to really spotlight that is an opportunity to build that sense of community.
Yeah, and I will confess that I had no idea what a CERT team was until I started learning more about this initiative and then working with this initiative, which it was so interesting to me because I think about the role that my family has kind of played when a hurricane has hit, and we're stepping up and we're helping neighbors, but there's not an organized system. And so the benefit that comes from having more plans in place and that preparedness piece that we were talking about, I think it's such a valuable place to strengthen CERT teams in neighborhoods.
And I think that formalizing those informal networks can be really powerful. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah. What are the other parts of disaster ecosystem that people in our community should know about? What other things are at play besides CERT teams?
Yeah, so that whole disaster response recovery cycle involves everybody. So anybody who cares about, you fill in the blank. We often say this. If you care about animals, you care about disasters. If you care about kids, you care about disasters. If you care about the environment, you care about disasters. If you care about economic viability, you care about disasters, because there's nothing that is untouched in that disaster environment. So I think there's so many pieces to that. We've been actively working with a couple of groups. One is the COADs. That's Community Organizations Active in Disaster. And so that's like a network of businesses, nonprofits, people who want to make sure that those immediate resources get out into the community. So what we all know is that if we have a relationship with somebody before there's a situation, then that response is strengthened, because when you already have communications underway, it makes a big difference. So the COADs meet all year long, and they've really been strengthening in our communities. It's exciting to see that network grow and the engagement build in that. So that's a COAD. And then we also are seeing a lot of work from the long-term recovery groups, or the LTRGs. And those are the folks who continue to invest in our community, both financial resources as well as supportive resources. So they might have an unmet needs table where they do individual case management. And so they might bring to the table, we have a family of 5 people, there's 3 kids, one of the children was injured in the storm, they lost their roof, have not been able to get insurance response yet. There's also some need for some mental health counseling with that family. What resources can we bring to bear to strengthen that family. And so that case management, that individual approach to families and their needs is really powerful in our community.
That makes sense. So we've got COADs and CERTs and long-term recovery groups and emergency management and services. How did the different operators work together?
Yeah, I think that's such a great question, Leah. And it really is an ecosystem. I think what we have seen is the involvement of local government, county emergency management, city emergency management in both the COADs and the long-term recovery groups, because they recognize that disaster cycle that I talked about, preparedness, response, recovery, mitigation to resilience, requires everyone to be a part of that. And that's what we're seeing is some opportunities to further build that, to really make sure that folks are talking to each other, they're hearing from each other, and they're listening to each other.
Yeah, that listening piece is so important. That leads me very well to my next question. I want to make sure our listeners know all about the inaugural 2026 CERT Summit. Rising Resilience Ready Together is happening on Thursday, January 29th from 8 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. at the Aura in Sarasota. Tell us about this event. Is it open to the public? And what else can you share about what's going to be happening?
Yeah, so we hosted a breakfast in July of CERT leaders and said, where are the gaps? What are the needs? If you had the magic wand, what would you wave it over? And so out of that came some responses and the development of this CERT Summit. We have a really great keynote speaker that we're excited to unveil, Craig Fugate, who is a former FEMA administrator, the head of the Federal Emergency Management Agency. But he started as a volunteer firefighter. He worked at local government. He led the state responses and the federal. So he has just this very, very cool, broad-based approach to disaster response and recovery. So Craig will be there. We'll have plenary sessions that are talking about sort of that foundational stuff of creating a CERT team. And then we'll have breakout sessions with very specific topics that will help people who are in an existing CERT team, as well as some who are considering being a part of a CERT team, and others who just want to see what this whole thing is all about. So the event is open. It's free to attend. We do have to have registrations in advance for planning purposes, and we're very excited about the opportunity.
That's so wonderful, and we'll make sure that we share the link for registration on the podcast. I want to dive into people's emotions a little bit. Tell me why somebody should show up. What are they going to learn or gain from by participating? And for those people who are like, everyone always thinks, maybe that's not for me. They're probably talking to someone else. How do we convince them that we are talking to them?
Yeah, we are talking to them. Anybody who cares about disaster, who cares about their neighborhood, who cares about their community, whether they're a business person, a community person, an organizational person, it's a space for everyone. Because, as I said earlier, if we know people before a disaster, if we have that relationship, it makes it so much easier to say, hey, we're desperate, can you help us? Or, hey, we have these resources, I know you might need them, can we help you? So we're talking to everyone. I want people to know that their role in that disaster ecosystem is so important. So if you're at all curious, we want you there. We're not going to put anyone on the spot. It's a non-threatening environment. We'll also have an exhibit hall there where people can learn about what CERT teams are doing, and then others in that space and be able to get some information there.
I think we talked about how, you're mentioning having those relationships beforehand. So much of the disaster response is reactionary for so many people because not everyone's truly invested until they're really affected. But I think if the last several years have demonstrated anything, it's really the value of knowing what resources are available and where you need to reach to find them, or how you can help others get there when they're in their time of need. I'm really excited about the summit. So
we're also excited. We're going to have a session about disaster mental health and, thinking about what those impacts are, trying to help people to understand, how we prepare for that emotionally, mentally. And I think that's a piece that has been sort of under appreciated in communities and historically.
Yeah. So this just came to mind. We've been talking about CERT teams and all of these different ways. And we're talking, we have a heavy focus on disasters, but do CERT teams function when a disaster is not happening in those blue sky moments, they call them? And how does that work?
Yeah, so CERT teams they meet once a month. They do different activities. They do training. They do fun things together. We had a CERT team who just the other day hosted a food drive in their community and had 733 pounds of food donated in 2 hours because they have built that sort of community network. So blue skies for CERTs, training on preparedness and the gaps in the community, helping people to assemble their disaster supply kits. They are busy all year round.
Yeah, and these are all things people will learn about at the summit. So in looking at the big picture of the CPR-R initiative, what outcomes are you seeking through this work? What is the big picture goal here, do you think?
Well, I think we know that we need to have more CERT teams in some of our neighborhoods. There are many of our less resourced neighborhoods who would really benefit from CERT teams. So we're hoping to build that capacity to be able to help stand those up. I think we have to put forth the preparedness message in a way that moves people to action. We see everything, there's so much information coming at us. And so you see 300 disaster supply lists, but does that move you to build a disaster supply kit for your family? So I think really trying to recognize what that looks like. We also have a lot of people moving to Florida every day who have never been in that hurricane environment. Yeah. And so I think that knowledge sharing is important. We often talk about sharing our cookies, sharing our knowledge and our skills. And so that's what we're trying to do with the CPR-R Initiative.
That's really so wonderful. You make a great point when you bring up all of the people that are moving here, because there is, if you're not a Floridian, then you just might not know the gravity of some of the things that go down here. So it's important for us to make sure all of those newcomers are getting connected to their resources that are needed also. Is there anything else that you would like to share with listeners today that we haven't touched on yet? No,
I think just reemphasizing that disasters are everyone's business. We make a choice to be prepared, or we make a choice to suffer the really unfortunate consequences. And so our goal is to make sure that people understand, have an opportunity, and think about it ahead of time when they can, or are connected enough to have those resources in their neighborhood.
Yeah, absolutely. This work in our area is really so vital and increasingly important as these storms get more and more wild. So I just want to thank you for joining me on the podcast today and sharing about the work of the CPR-R Initiative as you continue to build the connective tissue through all of the CERT teams and all of the different stakeholders that are involved. I just appreciate you being here and sharing about all that's happening in this initiative. So thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Listeners, to learn more about the work of this initiative and others, please visit thepattersonfoundation.org.